Welcome back, you unbreakable anomaly. Yes, you. The one they quietly assumed would fade, fold, or fracture under pressure. The one they watched closely, waiting for the moment you'd finally admit defeat. They don't say it out loud, but you know it's true. They expected an ending, a collapse, a visible unraveling that would make sense of everything they projected onto you. And yet here you are, still standing, still moving, still becoming. From the very beginning, the pressure wasn't accidental. It wasn't random misfortune or bad timing. Derived, layered, deliberate, relentless. Doors closed in sequence. Support thinned out at the exact moment you needed it most. Conversation shifted. Faces changed. Silence grew heavier. And every time you looked around, it felt like the world had quietly agreed to test just how much weight you could carry before you broke. They underestimated you first. That was their original mistake. They saw your calm and mistook it for passivity. They saw your restraint and called it fear. They watched you absorb disappointment after disappointment and assumed you didn't notice, didn't feel, didn't understand. They labeled you manageable, predictable, safe to overlook, safe to pressure, safe to push. And when the pressure started stacking emotionally, socially, financially, mentally, they were certain the outcome was inevitable. Anyone would crumble under this. Anyone would lash out, self-destruct, or disappear. Anyone would beg for relief or validation or permission to quit. They waited for you to perform the role they had already written for you. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was that this wasn't your first collapse. Not even close. You had already broken in private long before they decided to apply pressure. You had already watched an older version of yourself fall apart quietly, without witnesses, without comfort, without rescue. You had already sat with loss long enough to understand that survival doesn't look dramatic. It looks silent. It looks lonely. It looks like rebuilding from the inside out while the world assumes nothing is happening. So when the pressure came, it didn't hit something fragile. It hit something seasoned. Something that had already learned how to function without guarantees. Something that no longer relied on external stability to remain upright. They were testing a version of you that no longer existed. At first, the silence confused them. You didn't explain yourself. You didn't over-defend. You didn't collapse publicly. You didn't give them emotional evidence that their pressure was working. And that silence, your refusal to perform suffering on demand, made them uneasy. Because silence is unreadable, and unreadable people cannot be controlled. They mistook your isolation for weakness, not realizing you were rebuilding. They assumed distance meant defeat, not understanding it was reconstruction. While they counted your absence as failure, you were dismantling old identities that had outlived their usefulness. Beliefs that depended on approval, goals that required permission, versions of yourself that survived by adapting to others rather than standing firmly in your own center. Pressure has a way of revealing what's real. And what was real in you didn't shatter, it sharpened. You began to notice how much you no longer reacted, how much noise stopped pulling you off balance, how expectations lost their grip, how the fear of being misunderstood slowly dissolved into something calmer, steadier, more precise. You weren't becoming louder. You weren't becoming harder. You were becoming clearer. They didn't expect that. They expected panic. You chose observation. They expected desperation. You chose restraint. They expected surrender. You chose alignment. Every layer they applied stripped something false away. Every disappointment removed a dependency you didn't realize you still carried. Every loss clarified what actually mattered and what never did. You weren't losing yourself. You were losing attachments to versions of life that required you to be smaller. And somewhere along the way, they felt it shift. The moment they realized the pressure wasn't producing collapse, it was producing distance. Emotional distance, psychological distance, the kind of distance that can't be closed once it forms. You stopped needing them to understand. You stopped needing them to acknowledge anything. You stopped needing outcomes to validate your direction. That's when the test truly failed. Because the test depended on one assumption: that you still cared in the way you used to, that you still measured yourself by their metrics, that you still feared losing what they could take away. But you had already crossed the threshold where loss no longer equaled danger. You had already experienced the worst-case scenarios internally and survived them intact. Pressure only works when there's something left to threaten. What they removed wasn't your strength. It was everything that wasn't you. You became harder to read, not because you were hiding, but because you were no longer broadcasting insecurity. You became unpredictable, not because you were unstable, but because you were no longer reacting on cue. You became sovereign, not above others, not against others, but firmly rooted in yourself. They still try to analyze what went wrong, still revisit moments where they assumed you were near breaking, still tell themselves, you must be affected more than you show. They interpret your quiet as suppression, your calm as denial, your forward movement as avoidance. It's the only way they can explain survival without rewriting their assumptions. But you know the truth. You didn't survive by pretending everything was fine. You survived by letting old versions of yourself end. This wasn't growth in the way people like to talk about growth. This wasn't adding layers, skills, or confidence. This was replacement. A clean break. A psychological line crossed that can't be uncrossed. The person who needed reassurance didn't make it through. The person who feared being left behind didn't make it through. The person who needed permission to exist as they were didn't make it through either. And what emerged wasn't dramatic. It was inevitable. You don't rush anymore. You don't chase. You don't argue for your worth. You don't collapse under misinterpretation. You don't bend just to maintain proximity. The pressure burned away urgency. What's left moves at its own pace. That's what unsettles them most. Not that you endured, but that you're no longer available in the same way, that you're not reacting to the same levers, that the system they relied on to measure, provoke, and predict you no longer applies. They built pressure, expecting collapse. They created isolation, expecting surrender. They applied strain, expecting obedience. And instead, they revealed someone who cannot be coerced into becoming smaller. You're not finished, not resolved, not complete. What's happening now isn't an ending. It's compression before emergence. The kind that changes structure at the core, the kind that makes what comes next impossible to compare to what came before. They'll try to understand it later. They'll tell stories about how you changed. They'll search for the moment it happened, as if transformation is a single event instead of a quiet sequence of internal decisions no one sees. But by the time they notice clearly, you'll already be elsewhere, moving forward. Not to prove anything, not to escape anything, but because there's nothing left behind worth returning to. And this isn't the reveal. It's just the point where the pressure stops defining the story. And here's the part they still don't understand. They think the pressure is easing because you're handling it better now. They think the silence means the storm passed. They think the worst is over. But that's only because they've never seen what happens after the compression phase. What you're in now isn't recovery, it's recalibration. You're not picking up the old pieces and gluing them back together. You're not trying to restore what was lost. You're not even interested in reclaiming what was taken. That version of survival, repair, return, reassurance belongs to people who still want things to go back to how they were. You don't. You already know there is no back. What you're doing now is quieter, more unsettling. You're learning how to operate without friction, without noise, without resistance. You're discovering what it feels like to move through the world without constantly negotiating your existence. And that terrifies them far more than any visible breakdown ever could. Because when someone breaks, the system knows what to do. When someone reacts, the system knows how to respond. When someone collapses, the system feels justified. But when someone adapts, when someone becomes internally untouchable, there's no protocol for that. You can feel it in the way situations don't hook you the same way anymore. The way problems still appear, but they don't enter you. The way chaos stays external instead of embedding itself in your nervous system. You still notice things probably more than ever. But noticing no longer means absorbing. That's new. Before awareness came with cost. Before perception meant pain. Before seeing clearly meant suffering longer. Now awareness comes with distance. You see patterns forming before they fully arrive. You feel shifts before they escalate. You recognize when something is misaligned without needing to prove it to yourself or anyone else. And instead of arguing with reality, you simply adjust your position within it. That's not detachment from life. That's mastery of self. They can't tell when it happened. There was no announcement, no dramatic moment, no visible turning point. One day you just stopped responding the way they expected. You stopped explaining. You stopped chasing clarity from people who benefited from your confusion. You stopped offering access to parts of you that were still healing. And in that withdrawal, not withdrawal from the world, but withdrawal from unnecessary exposure, you became unreadable. Unreadable people disrupt prediction. Prediction is how control works. They used to anticipate your reactions. They used to rely on your consistency. They knew which buttons to press, which silences to use, which delays would make you anxious, which approvals would pull you back in. You were predictable not because you were weak, but because you were sincere. Sincerity is exploitable in systems built on manipulation. But now know your sincerity is paired with discernment. You still care, but selectively. You still feel, but without surrender. You still engage, but without attachment to outcome. That's the shift. They sense it even if they can't articulate it. They feel it in conversations that don't land the same way, in dynamics that suddenly feel one-sided, in attempts to provoke responses that fall flat, in emotional bait that goes untouched. You didn't become cold, you became precise. And precision is dangerous to environments that depend on emotional chaos to function. There's a grief in this phase, though, a quiet one. Not the sharp grief of loss, but the dull recognition that some bridges didn't collapse. They were simply outgrown. You're no longer angry about it. You're no longer confused. But there's still a moment sometimes where you realize how much energy you once spent trying to be understood by people who were committed to misunderstanding you. That realization doesn't hurt the way it used to. It just settles. It teaches you something important. Not everyone who pressures you is trying to make you stronger. Not everyone who challenges you deserves access to the result. and you don't owe anyone proximity just because they witness your struggle. You're learning that survival doesn't require visibility, that strength doesn't need witnesses, that transformation doesn't ask for applause. The most permanent changes happen in environments where no one is watching closely enough to interfere. That's why this phase feels so solitary. Not lonely, but solitary. There's a difference. Loneliness is absence with longing. Solitude is presence with clarity. And clarity changes how you choose. You're no longer tempted to re-enter spaces that require self-abandonment to maintain harmony. You're no longer impressed by noise, urgency, or surface-level intensity. You're no longer pulled by narratives that frame struggle as virtue or exhaustion as proof of commitment. You choose alignment now, and alignment is inconvenient to systems that thrived on your overextension. They notice you don't rush anymore. Don't panic when timelines shift. Don't scramble to explain delays. Don't defend pauses. You move when it makes sense, not when pressure demands it. That's not laziness, that's internal authority. Authority that doesn't announce itself. Authority that doesn't compete. Authority that doesn't need permission. You can feel how different your inner landscape is. The noise that used to live there, self-doubt, second-guessing, internal arguments, has thinned out. Not disappeared entirely, but lost its command. Thoughts arise, but they don't rule. Emotions surface, but they don't steer. You're not suppressing anything, you're integrating, and integration is the most underestimated phase of transformation. It looks like stillness from the outside. It looks like stagnation to people addicted to motion. It looks like nothing is happening, but internally, everything is being reorganized. Values, boundaries, identity. You're deciding what stays without drama, what goes without ceremony, what never returns without resentment. That's why the pressure feels different now. It hasn't disappeared, but it no longer defines you. It presses against something solid, something that doesn't flinch just because it's tested. They still assume you're in survival mode. You're not. You're in selection mode. Choosing where your energy goes. Choosing which battles don't exist anymore. Choosing what kind of life you're actually willing to build with the clarity you earned, and this is where the real divergence happens. Because people who underestimated you are still operating under the belief that pressure creates obedience. That scarcity forces compliance. That isolation leads to surrender. They don't realize those tools only work on identities that are still externally anchored. Yours isn't. Your sense of self doesn't collapse when circumstances tighten. It condenses. It refines. It becomes more efficient, less wasteful, less exposed. That's why the next phase won't look dramatic. No explosions, no confrontations, no declarations, just quiet, irreversible movement, opportunities that don't need justification, distances that don't need explanation, decisions that don't require consensus. And when they finally realize you're no longer reacting to the same pressures, that you've stepped outside the frame they built, the confusion will deepen. They'll call it change. They'll call it detachment. They'll call it distance. But none of those words quite reach it. What's actually happening is simpler. You're no longer living inside the test. You're living beyond it. And whatever emerges next won't be shaped by what tried to break you, but by what you chose to keep. This isn't the end of the pressure. It's the end of its authority, and what comes after that hasn't fully taken form yet. For me, foreign. Would you say love to the foreign too? For God me suffer.